They invited his black ex-wife to the wedding for one reason only: to prove she never belonged in their world. The Wellington family was certain Ellie would arrive broken, alone, and drowning in the shame of her past. They had prepared the perfect humiliation: a seat at the back, near the exit, surrounded by pitying glances and whispered judgments. But when the ceremony doors opened, Ellie didn't walk in alone. Two 4-year-old children stood beside her, twins with their father's unmistakable eyes. And in that single moment, the perfect wedding began to collapse. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Drop your country or city in the comments. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss stories like this one. 5 years before that wedding, Ellie Johnson had believed in love the way only the young and hopeful can. She had met Frank Wellington during their junior year at Columbia University, in a crowded lecture hall where he sat 2 rows behind her. He was charming, attentive, and completely unlike the privileged heir she would later discover him to be. For 2 years, they built something she thought was unbreakable: late-night conversations about their dreams, stolen kisses between classes, and promises whispered in the dark. When Frank proposed, Ellie said yes without hesitation. She knew his family was wealthy. She knew they owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. But she also believed that love could bridge any gap, that the way Frank looked at her meant more than any family name or bank account. She was wrong. The first time Ellie entered the Wellington estate in Connecticut, Eleanor Wellington looked at her the way one might examine an insect that had wandered into a pristine kitchen. The smile on Eleanor's face never reached her eyes, and her handshake was brief, almost reluctant, as if she feared contamination. Richard Wellington, Frank's father, barely acknowledged Ellie's presence at all. He spoke to his son as though she weren't standing right there, discussing business matters and family obligations, while Ellie stood in their marble foyer, feeling smaller with each passing second. But Ellie told herself it would get better. She told herself they just needed time to know her, to see how much she loved their son. The wedding was small and quiet, not because Ellie wanted it that way, but because Eleanor insisted. A large celebration would be inappropriate, she explained, given that the bride's family couldn't possibly contribute equally. The message was clear. This marriage was an embarrassment to be minimized, not a union to be celebrated. For 2 years, Ellie tried everything. She learned which fork to use at formal dinners. She studied the names of Eleanor's society friends and memorized their children's accomplishments. She bit her tongue when Eleanor made comments about her hair, her clothes, the way she spoke. She smiled through family gatherings where she was seated at the far end of the table, separated from Frank by cousins and aunts who looked through her as if she were made of glass. The worst part wasn't the obvious cruelty. It was the subtle erosion, the daily reminders that she didn't belong. Eleanor would mention other women, daughters of business partners, debutantes from old money families, and wonder aloud why Frank hadn't chosen someone more suitable. Richard once told Ellie directly, during a Christmas dinner when he'd had too much scotch, that she could stay in the family, but she would never truly be part of it. And through it all, Frank said nothing. He would hold her hand under the table sometimes, squeeze it gently as if to say he understood, but he never spoke up. He never defended her. When Ellie begged him to set boundaries with his mother, he would kiss her forehead and promise that things would improve, that his parents just needed more time. Time, Ellie learned, was not their friend. The breaking point came on a cold February evening, 2 years into their marriage. Ellie had just discovered she was pregnant. She hadn't told Frank yet. She wanted to find the perfect moment, to see the joy on his face when he learned they were going to be parents. But before she could share the news, Eleanor summoned Frank to the family study. Ellie wasn't invited, but she could hear their voices through the heavy oak door. Eleanor's ultimatum was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Frank had a choice to make: He could remain married to Ellie and be cut off from the family fortune, stripped of his position in the company, and written out of the will entirely. Or he could end this unfortunate chapter and return to the life he was born to live. Ellie pressed her hand against her still flat stomach and waited for her husband to fight for her. Instead, she heard Frank ask for time. He needed to think. He needed to figure out how to let Ellie down gently. That night, Ellie packed a single suitcase while Frank slept. She left her wedding ring on his nightstand with a note that said only 3 words. "I heard everything." She didn't tell him about the pregnancy. She couldn't. Because in that moment, listening through that door, Ellie had seen her future with terrible clarity. If the Wellingtons knew about this child, these children, as she would later discover, they would never let go. They had the money and the lawyers to take everything from her. They would fight for custody not out of love, but out of control. And they would raise her children to believe that their mother was a mistake, a stain on the family legacy that needed to be scrubbed clean. So Ellie disappeared. She moved to Atlanta, where a college friend helped her find a small apartment. She worked 2 jobs while pregnant, saved every penny, and gave birth to twins, a boy named Isaiah and a girl named Zoe, in a hospital where no one knew her name. She built a new life from nothing, earned her MBA through night classes, and eventually started her own marketing consulting firm. It wasn't easy. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she'd made the right choice. There were moments when Isaiah would tilt his head a certain way, or Zoe would laugh with a particular rhythm, and Ellie would see Frank so clearly it took her breath away. But she never regretted leaving. She only regretted that leaving had been necessary. For 5 years, Ellie kept her secret. She told her children that their father lived far away, that sometimes families looked different, and that what mattered most was that they had each other. She built walls around her heart so high that no one could climb them. And then the invitation arrived. It came in a cream-colored envelope, heavy with expensive paper, addressed to Ms. Ellie Johnson in elegant calligraphy. Inside was an invitation to the wedding of Frank Andrew Wellington and Victoria Elizabeth Hartley, to be held at the Wellington estate on the 15th of June. But it was the handwritten note tucked inside that made Ellie's hands shake. Eleanor's handwriting was immediately recognizable, the same precise script that had signed checks for caterers and country club memberships. The message was brief and devastating in its false sweetness. "We do hope you'll attend. It would mean so much to Frank to have closure, and to show everyone how graciously we've all moved forward. After all, some chapters are better closed with witnesses." Ellie read those words 3 times before their meaning fully registered. This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to her own humiliation. Eleanor wanted her there as proof that Frank had upgraded his life, that the unfortunate mistake of his first marriage had been corrected. Ellie would be the cautionary tale, the before picture in their perfect after. Her first instinct was to throw the invitation away. She had spent 5 years building a life free from the Wellingtons. Why would she willingly walk back into their world? But that night, after putting the twins to bed, Ellie sat in her living room and really looked at her children for the first time in a long while. Isaiah had Frank's jawline, his serious expression when he concentrated on a puzzle. Zoe had his eyes, those distinctive gray-green eyes that no one could mistake for anyone else's. They were 4 years old now, asking more questions every day. "Where did I come from, Mommy? Why don't we have a daddy like other kids? Do I look like him?" Ellie had always planned to tell them the truth someday. She just thought she would have more time to figure out how. But Eleanor's invitation changed everything. Because if Ellie stayed silent, if she continued hiding in Atlanta while Frank married another woman, she would be letting the Wellingtons control the narrative forever. They would tell their version of history, the gold digger ex-wife who ran away, the bullet Frank had dodged, the family that had righteously protected their own from an unsuitable match. And someday, When Isaiah and Zoe were old enough to search for answers, that's the story they would find. Ellie couldn't let that happen, so she made a decision that terrified her. She would go to the wedding, but she wouldn't go alone, and she wouldn't go quietly. She would bring her children, Frank's children, and she would force the truth into the light. It wasn't about revenge. Ellie had long since released her anger toward Frank. He was weak, not evil, and she had made peace with his limitations. This was about something bigger. This was about refusing to be erased. This was about showing her children that their mother never had anything to be ashamed of, that she had walked away with her head held high and her dignity intact. The Wellingtons had spent 5 years believing they had won. They thought Ellie was somewhere struggling, broken, proof of their righteous judgment. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Ellie spent 2 weeks preparing. She had documents ready, birth certificates, medical records, everything she might need if the situation escalated. She bought the children new clothes, simple but elegant. She chose her own outfit carefully, a deep burgundy dress that fit perfectly, sophisticated without trying too hard. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her overdressed and desperate for approval. The night before the flight to Connecticut, Ellie sat on the edge of Isaiah's bed and watched her twins sleep. They looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm she was about to walk them into. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was she being selfish? Was she using her children as weapons in a battle they never asked to fight? But then she remembered Eleanor's note. She remembered the years of degradation, the constant message that she was less than, that she didn't deserve to exist in their world. No, she wasn't using her children. She was claiming them. She was standing up and declaring to the world that these beautiful, brilliant kids were hers, that they existed, and that no amount of Wellington money could erase that truth. Tomorrow, Ellie would walk into that wedding, and nothing would ever be the same. The Wellington estate looked exactly as Ellie remembered it, imposing, immaculate, and designed to make outsiders feel small. The sprawling Georgian mansion sat on 12 acres of manicured gardens, its white columns gleaming in the June sunlight like teeth in a predator's smile. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and uniformed valets moved with practiced efficiency, guiding guests toward the ceremony tent erected on the south lawn. Ellie arrived in a rental car, deliberately modest. She had left the twins with her hotel room's connecting door open, watched over by her trusted assistant who had flown up with them. The plan was simple. Ellie would enter the wedding alone first, assess the situation, and then bring the children in at the right moment. She needed to see the battlefield before committing her most precious soldiers. The moment she stepped out of the car, Ellie felt the weight of 100 stares. She recognized some faces from her marriage. Society wives who had whispered behind their hands at charity galas, business associates who had looked through her at dinner parties. They watched her now with undisguised curiosity, surprised that she had actually shown up. A young woman in a black uniform approached with a practiced smile, checking names against her tablet. When Ellie gave her name, something flickered across the woman's face. Recognition, perhaps, or pity. She directed Ellie toward the back of the tent, to a table near the service entrance where the clink of catering equipment provided a constant reminder of her designated place. Ellie walked through the crowd with her head high, her burgundy dress catching the light. She had chosen well, elegant enough to belong, understated enough not to seem desperate. But she felt every sideways glance, every whispered comment that followed in her wake. She had barely taken her seat when Eleanor Wellington materialized beside her, moving with the silent grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime controlling rooms. Eleanor wore pale blue, mother of the groom appropriate. Her silver hair swept into a perfect chignon. Her smile was warm enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. Eleanor's voice carried just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. She expressed such delight that Ellie had come. How mature and gracious it was of her, how Frank would be so pleased to see that everyone had moved on. The words were honey poured over poison, sweet and deadly. Ellie met Eleanor's gaze without flinching. She thanked her for the invitation, mentioned how lovely the estate looked, and said nothing more. Her composure seemed to unsettle Eleanor, who had clearly expected tears or anger or some display of the weakness she could later describe to her friends. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Eleanor glided away to greet more important guests, leaving Ellie alone at her exile table. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Ellie used the time to observe, to remember, to prepare herself for what was coming. She watched Richard Wellington hold court near the champagne fountain, his silver hair and commanding presence drawing a constant stream of admirers. She watched the bridesmaids flutter about in matching lavender, adjusting each other's hair and giggling with pre-wedding excitement. And then she saw Victoria. The bride stood near the entrance of the main house, surrounded by attendants making final adjustments to her veil. Victoria Hartley was beautiful in the conventional way that the Wellingtons would approve of. Tall, slender, with honey blonde hair and delicate features that spoke of generations of careful breeding. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of lace and silk, probably costing more than Ellie's first year of business revenue. But there was something in Victoria's expression that caught Ellie's attention. Behind the practiced smile, behind the bridal glow, there was uncertainty. Perhaps even fear. Ellie recognized that look. She had worn it herself once. As if sensing the observation, Victoria turned, and their eyes met across the crowded lawn. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then, to Ellie's surprise, Victoria said something to her attendants and began walking toward the back of the tent. The bride approached Ellie's table with careful steps, her massive dress rustling against the grass. Up close, Victoria was younger than Ellie had expected, perhaps 28 or 29, with nervous energy radiating from every pore. Victoria introduced herself quietly, as if Ellie might not know who she was. She mentioned that she knew Ellie was Frank's ex-wife, that Eleanor had pointed her out earlier. Her voice carried no malice, only curiosity, and something that sounded almost like desperation for connection. Ellie responded carefully, congratulating her on the wedding, commenting on the beautiful arrangements. But Victoria pressed on. She admitted that she had wanted to meet Ellie, to understand what had happened. Frank never talked about his first marriage, and Eleanor dismissed it as a youthful mistake best forgotten. Victoria wanted to know the truth, or at least Ellie's version of it. The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Ellie chose her words with precision. She asked Victoria if she truly knew Frank, or only the version his family had constructed. She suggested that some truths were better discovered before vows were exchanged rather than after. Victoria's face paled slightly, but before she could respond, a bridesmaid appeared at her elbow, insisting that the ceremony was about to begin, that she needed to take her position. The bride cast one last uncertain glance at Ellie before being swept away toward her future. 15 minutes later, the string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon, and 300 guests rose to their feet. Ellie remained seated at her back table, watching as the wedding party processed down the white silk aisle. The groomsmen came first, then the bridesmaids, then a flower girl scattering rose petals with studied precision. Frank appeared at the altar, and Ellie felt her breath catch despite herself. 5 years had changed him. His shoulders were broader, his jaw more defined, and threads of gray touched his temples. He looked successful, confident, every inch the Wellington heir he was born to be. But Ellie noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the guests, searching for something, or someone. Then Victoria emerged from the house on her father's arm, and everyone's attention shifted to the bride. She was radiant, of course. She smiled at Frank with what appeared to be genuine affection. The minister began his welcome, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Ellie slipped away from her table. She walked back to her rental car, drove the quarter-mile to where her assistant waited with the twins, and prepared them for what was about to happen. Isaiah and Zoe looked adorable in their matching outfits. Isaiah in a small navy blazer, Zoe in a cream-colored dress with a burgundy sash that matched Ellie's own gown. They didn't understand why they were at this big party, but they trusted their mother, and that was enough. The walk back to the ceremony felt like the longest of Ellie's life. She held each child by the hand, their small fingers warm against her palms. The music from the tent grew louder as they approached, and she could hear the minister asking if anyone knew any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. Ellie pushed open the tent flap and stepped inside. The reaction was instantaneous. 300 heads turned as one, drawn by the movement at the back of the tent. Whispers erupted like scattered gunfire. Who was that? Why were there children? What was happening? Ellie walked down the center aisle, Isaiah on her left, Zoe on her right. She kept her pace measured, her expression calm. She wasn't running or hiding anymore. She was simply walking into her truth. Eleanor was the first to react, rising from her seat in the front row with a face twisted in fury. She demanded to know what this was, who had let this woman bring children into the ceremony, calling it an outrage and a disruption. But Eleanor's voice faded as Frank turned to face the interruption. His eyes found Ellie first, recognition and confusion warring across his features. Then his gaze dropped to the children, and Ellie watched the color drain from his face. Isaiah looked up at the man before him, curious and unafraid. Zoe tilted her head in that particular way she had inherited from her father. And everyone looking, could see the truth written in bone and blood and undeniable genetics. Victoria's bouquet slipped from her fingers and landed soundlessly on the silk runner. Ellie stopped walking when she reached the middle of the aisle. She didn't need to go further. She didn't need to shout or accuse or demand anything. The evidence was standing beside her, holding her hands, blinking at the crowd with their father's distinctive gray-green eyes. When Ellie finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. She told Frank that he deserved to know. She said that her children deserved to know who their father was. She explained that she had kept silent for 5 years to protect them from a family that would have used the courts to erase her from their lives. But she refused to let them grow up believing their mother had anything to be ashamed of. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Frank took a single step forward, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, he managed to ask why she hadn't told him, his voice cracking on the words. Ellie's response was quiet but devastating. She asked him what he would have done differently. She reminded him that he couldn't even defend her to his mother. She pointed out that he had chosen his inheritance over their marriage without hesitation. She asked why she should have trusted him with something far more precious than herself. Frank had no answer. There was none to give. Victoria broke the tableau first. She turned to Frank with tears streaming down her face and asked if it was true. The question encompassed everything: the children, the past, the lies he had told by omission. Frank couldn't meet her eyes. His silence was confession enough. Victoria pulled the engagement ring from her finger, pressed it into Frank's palm, and walked out of the tent without looking back. Several bridesmaids hurried after her, their lavender dresses disappearing through the exit like retreating waves. Eleanor's composure shattered. She advanced on Ellie with fury contorting her features, accusing her of orchestrating this, of plotting revenge, of using innocent children to destroy her family. She threatened legal action, promised to have Ellie arrested for trespassing, swore that she would regret this day for the rest of her life. But Ellie stood her ground. She reminded Eleanor that these children were Wellingtons by blood, whether Eleanor liked it or not. She stated that the law would be very interested in hearing how Eleanor had threatened and harassed the mother of her grandchildren. She suggested that perhaps Eleanor should consult with her lawyers before making any more promises she couldn't keep. Richard Wellington finally intervened, placing a hand on his wife's arm and pulling her back. His face was unreadable, but Ellie noticed something in his eyes. Not anger, but calculation. He was already thinking about damage control, about how to spin this disaster. The wedding guests began dispersing in clusters, their voices rising in excited speculation. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, and Ellie knew that within the hour, this story would be spreading across social media and society pages alike. In the chaos, Frank approached Ellie with hesitant steps. He knelt down to look at Isaiah and Zoe, his hands trembling as he reached toward them without quite touching. He asked their names, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie told him. Isaiah, Zoe, 4 years old. Tears spilled down Frank's cheeks as the weight of 5 lost years crashed over him. He asked if he could hold them, if that would be okay. Ellie looked at her children, at their curious, unafraid faces. She told Frank that wasn't his decision to make, or hers. She said that if the children wanted to greet him, they could. Isaiah, ever the serious one, studied this crying stranger with solemn consideration. Then he extended his small hand the way Ellie had taught him to greet new people. Frank took it as if it were made of glass, a sob escaping his throat. But this wasn't reconciliation. This wasn't forgiveness. This was simply the first acknowledgement of a truth that could no longer be denied. The war was far from over. Even as Frank knelt before his children, Eleanor was already retreating to the house, phone in hand, undoubtedly calling the family attorneys. The Wellington machine was preparing to mobilize, and Ellie knew that the real battle was just beginning. She had won this round, exposed the truth, refused to be erased. But Eleanor would not accept defeat quietly. The fight for her children was about to escalate beyond a ruined wedding, beyond society gossip, into something far more dangerous. Ellie gathered Isaiah and Zoe, thanked Frank for nothing in particular, and walked out of the tent into the bright June sunshine. Behind her, the perfect wedding lay in ruins. Ahead of her, the courthouse awaited. The Wellington counterattack came faster than Ellie had anticipated. Within 72 hours of the ruined wedding, she received a thick envelope from one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. The documents inside accused her of fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and parental alienation. Eleanor wasn't just seeking visitation rights for the grandchildren she had never acknowledged. She was petitioning for full custody, claiming that Ellie was an unfit mother who had deliberately concealed the children to extort the Wellington family. The media descended like vultures on fresh carrion. Headlines screamed about the wedding scandal, about the secret children, about the dramatic confrontation that had ended a society marriage before it began. Some outlets painted Ellie as a scorned woman seeking revenge. Others portrayed her as a gold digger who had hidden her pregnancy to maximize future leverage. Very few bothered to ask for her side of the story. Ellie's children began to feel the pressure. Isaiah came home from preschool one day, asking why other kids were saying mean things about their mommy. Zoe had nightmares about strangers trying to take her away. Ellie held them close each night, promising that everything would be okay, even as she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Her lawyer, a civil rights attorney named Patricia Hayes, who had taken the case pro bono after seeing the news coverage, warned Ellie that the Wellingtons would fight dirty. They had unlimited resources and decades of connections in the legal system. Winning against them would require more than just truth. It would require exposing the patterns of manipulation and prejudice that had defined Eleanor's behavior for years. The custody hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the wedding. During that time, Ellie gathered every piece of evidence she could find. Old emails, text messages, records of the dinner where Richard had told her she would never belong. A journal she had kept during her marriage, documenting each humiliation in careful detail. She hadn't known why she was saving these things at the time. Now she understood. Some part of her had always known this day would come. The night before the hearing, Ellie sat alone in her Atlanta apartment after the twins had fallen asleep. Fear pressed against her chest like a physical weight. She had built her entire life around protecting Isaiah and Zoe, and now that protection might be stripped away by a judge who had probably golfed with Richard Wellington. Her phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Victoria Hartley, the woman who should have become Frank's wife. Victoria had been silent since walking out of the wedding, but now she reached out with words that surprised Ellie. Victoria wrote that she wanted to help. She explained that in the weeks since the canceled wedding, she had learned things about the Wellington family that horrified her. Eleanor had shown her true face once the public mask was no longer necessary. Cruel, controlling, and utterly without remorse. Victoria had recordings of conversations where Eleanor discussed how to destroy Ellie's reputation, how to paint her as mentally unstable, how to ensure the twins were raised as proper Wellingtons with no memory of their mother. Victoria offered to testify. She said it was the least she could do. Ellie stared at that message for a long time before typing a simple response. She thanked Victoria genuinely and without reservation. Sometimes allies came from the most unexpected places. The family court building in Manhattan was intimidating by design. All marble floors and echoing chambers meant to remind visitors of the weight of the law. Ellie arrived early with Patricia, both women dressed in conservative suits, their files organized with military precision. The Wellington legal team occupied the opposite table like an invading army. 4 attorneys in identical dark suits, plus Eleanor and Richard sitting rigid with barely concealed contempt. Frank was there too, seated slightly apart from his parents. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. When Ellie entered, their eyes met briefly. She saw something in his expression that might have been regret, or perhaps just the hollow recognition of how thoroughly he had failed. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Collins, known for her no-nonsense approach and her impatience with wealthy families who tried to manipulate her courtroom. Ellie felt a small spark of hope when she saw who would be presiding. Eleanor's lawyers presented their case first. They painted a picture of Ellie as a calculating opportunist who had deliberately hidden her pregnancy to escape the marriage with maximum leverage intact. They argued that she had denied the children their birthright, their heritage, their family. They presented financial records suggesting Ellie couldn't provide the same advantages the Wellingtons could offer. They questioned her judgment, her stability, her fitness as a mother. Through it all, Ellie sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. Then it was Patricia's turn. The evidence unfolded methodically. Emails from Eleanor to Frank during the marriage, pressuring him to end things with Ellie, text messages containing racial microaggressions, each one small on its own but devastating in accumulation. The journal entries documenting years of psychological abuse. Medical records showing that Ellie had sought therapy for anxiety and depression during her marriage, conditions that had mysteriously resolved after she left. But the turning point came when Victoria Hartley took the stand. The former almost bride walked into the courtroom with quiet dignity, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's furious glare. Under oath, Victoria described what she had witnessed in the weeks after the canceled wedding. She recounted conversations where Eleanor had discussed strategies to take the children from Ellie, not out of love for her grandchildren, but to punish Ellie for humiliating the family. She played recordings of Eleanor calling Ellie a worthless woman who never deserved to breathe Wellington air, declaring that those children needed to be raised properly away from her influence. Eleanor's attorney objected repeatedly, but the recordings were authenticated and admitted. The judge's expression grew increasingly grim as she listened. Then Frank asked to speak. The request caught everyone off guard, including his own legal team. Eleanor hissed at him to sit down, but Frank stood anyway, approaching the witness stand with the uncertain steps of a man walking toward his own execution. Under oath, Frank testified against his own family. He confirmed every detail of Ellie's journal entries. He admitted that his mother had delivered an ultimatum, divorce Ellie or lose everything, and that he had been too cowardly to fight back. He acknowledged that he had suspected Ellie might be pregnant when she left, that certain things she had said made more sense in retrospect, but that he had been too afraid to pursue the truth. His voice broke when he admitted that Ellie had been right not to tell him. He said he wouldn't have protected the children from his mother. He confessed that he wouldn't have been strong enough. He acknowledged that he was 5 years too late to be the man Ellie had deserved. The courtroom was utterly silent when he finished. Eleanor looked at her son as if seeing a stranger, her face white with rage and betrayal. Richard stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable but his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Judge Collins called for a brief recess before delivering her ruling. When court resumed, the judge spoke with measured precision. She had reviewed all evidence and testimony. She found the Wellington family's petition for custody to be without merit and motivated by vindictiveness rather than genuine concern for the children's welfare. She noted that Ellie had demonstrated consistent care for her children's physical and emotional needs, while the Wellingtons had demonstrated consistent disregard for basic human decency. The judge awarded full custody to Ellie, with visitation rights for Frank to be determined by mutual agreement between the parents, not by the Wellington family lawyers. She issued a stern warning that any further harassment of Ellie or her children would result in severe legal consequences. Eleanor rose from her seat, her composure finally shattering. She demanded to know how the judge could side with that woman, declaring that the Wellingtons had built half of this city, that they would not be dismissed by some activist judge with an agenda. Judge Collins's response was ice cold. She told Eleanor that in her courtroom, the only thing that mattered was the welfare of the children. She stated that wealth and influence meant nothing within these walls. She advised Eleanor to leave before she was held in contempt. Richard finally intervened, taking his wife's arm and guiding her toward the exit. Eleanor went, but not before casting one final venomous look at Ellie. A promise that this wasn't over, that the war would continue by other means. But Ellie knew better. The war was over. Eleanor had fired her best shots and missed. The truth had been entered into public record, the family's carefully constructed image shattered beyond repair. There would be no more threats, no more manipulation, no more attempts to erase Ellie from her children's lives. Frank approached her outside the courtroom, his legal team having abandoned him to regroup. He looked like a man who had finally set down a burden he'd been carrying his entire life. He told Ellie he was sorry. He admitted it was inadequate, that nothing he said could make up for what she had endured. He asked only for a chance to know his children, to be some kind of father to them, even if he had no right to ask for anything. Ellie studied the man she had once loved, the man who had broken her heart with his weakness. She didn't feel anger anymore, or even disappointment. She felt something closer to pity. She told Frank that she didn't need his apology. She explained that she had stopped needing anything from him years ago, but she acknowledged that the children might need something from him someday, a father, or at least an explanation. She was willing to allow him that chance, but on her terms. She would decide when and how he entered their lives. She would protect them from anyone who might hurt them, including him. Frank accepted without argument. He had finally learned that some battles weren't his to fight. 2 days later, Ellie received a text message from Victoria. The younger woman had left New York entirely, moving to California to start over. She thanked Ellie for showing her the truth before it was too late, for demonstrating what real strength looked like. She wished Ellie and the children well. Ellie smiled at the message. Sometimes destruction made way for new growth. Sometimes the people you expected to be enemies became unexpected allies. The world was strange that way. The flight back to Atlanta was quiet. Isaiah and Zoe slept against her shoulders, their small bodies warm and trusting. The city of her past grew smaller in the airplane window until it disappeared entirely, replaced by endless sky and the promise of home. Ellie thought about everything she had survived. The marriage that had tried to diminish her. The family that had tried to erase her. The system that had almost been weaponized against her. She had faced it all and emerged not just intact, but stronger. She hadn't wanted revenge. She had never wanted to destroy the Wellingtons, or humiliate Frank, or ruin Victoria's wedding. She had wanted only one thing: to stand in the light and be seen for who she truly was. A mother, a survivor, a woman who refused to be ashamed of her own existence. The twins stirred as the plane began its descent into Atlanta. Zoe asked if they were home yet, her voice fuzzy with sleep. Ellie kissed her daughter's forehead and told her they were almost there. Isaiah, ever the serious one, asked if the mean people were gone now. Ellie considered the question. She told him that some mean people never really went away, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they had each other. What mattered was that they were strong. What mattered was that nobody could ever make them feel small unless they allowed it. Isaiah nodded solemnly, accepting this wisdom with the gravity of a 4-year-old philosopher. The plane touched down as the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ellie gathered her children, collected her bags, and walked out of the airport into the warm Georgia evening. Behind her was a ruined wedding, a shattered family dynasty, and a past that no longer had any power over her. Ahead was home. Ahead was peace. Ahead was a future she had built with her own hands, brick by brick, from the rubble of everything that had tried to break her. Ellie didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. She had already won. Thank you so much for staying with Ellie until the very end. If her story moved you or made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you. Until next time, take care of yourselves.